G'day. A few weeks back I did an episode on parting. Now originally I thought that one, there wouldn't be much to say about parting, and so I thought I'll put some knurling stuff in there because there's not much to say about that either. Well, to my surprise, the parting one went for about an episode, and the knurling stuff was about that too. So this is a separate episode on knurling. Hopefully there'll be some stuff in there that makes people think about how they're approaching it and improves the way they do it. These are all things that have got a knurl on them. Some of it is decorative. Mostly on tooling you'll have a knurl on there to give better grip for being able to turn something, and so that's a soldering tool, and that's got a knurl on there, and that sits quite firmly. Similar to the micrometer. The micrometer is a straight knurl. That's a cross knurl or a diamond knurl. These are done in two ways. What we do in the home workshop is usually called a crush knurl or something like that, and it's basically displacing material. There is another device out there which cuts those knurls. The thing about knurling, or crush knurling as we usually do in the home workshop, is that you're trying to displace the material. So you're pushing material from where the spikes, I guess, the teeth on the knurling roller are, and trying to get that material to move up into that space. So if you think about that, that's probably the reason that a lot of knurling doesn't come out looking as you'd like to do it. Because if you overdo that material's got no place to go. So what it's going to do is go all crunchy and displace itself in places you don't want. If you haven't got that pushed in enough, you're going to get this half-formed pattern, which sometimes is what you want, but it's one of those things that it takes a little bit of practice, it takes a little bit of feel to get that right. The two ways that I've got of doing this are either by feel, and you'll find that when you do the knob up on your knurling device, you'll get to a point where it suddenly feels like it's getting a little bit stiffer, right? That's the point where that cavity is pretty much full, okay? So you stop. The other way of doing it, which I do occasionally, particularly if I'm using an extra fine or an extra coarse knurl which I'm not familiar with, is I know that has to feed in half the height of that, what would you call that gullet, okay? So because I know the ratio on the screw on my knurling device, I know the size of that gullet, I know the size of my stock, all that sort of thing, I can calculate that I need to apply, say, half a turn to the knob that pulls these rollers in, and that'll be sufficient. And so that's another way I do that. Don't do it often. These are the knurling wheels that I have. They're a hardened steel wheel, and they've got a cut in them, and I think that angle's about 90 degrees. They range from quite large to small. So this one here is a 12 TPI knurl, straight knurl. That one's a 33 TPI. It's half of a diamond knurl set, and that's a 16 diamond set. You have a left hand and a right hand, and that's because one wheel does the diamond cuts one way, and the other one does the diamond cuts or diamond displacements the other way, and that's what gives you your diamond. If you just ran one of those, you'd get a diagonal knurl. There are other types of knurl out there. Clockmakers will do what's called a rope knurl, and that's a special thing that looks like a piece of rope that's been coiled over something. But for general machine work, it's usually either a diamond knurl or a straight knurl. These are my knurling tools. This is the one I use for a straight knurl, and this is the one I use for diamond knurling, cross knurling. And the way this works is that by turning this knob, there's a left hand thread and a right hand thread, and that just brings those two wheels together, pinches onto the material. As I said in the last video, it's a variation of a scissor knurl, and that's just because by having these two rollers opposing each other, you're not putting force on the bearings. With this style, you have to basically push that into the material, and the forces can be quite high. For my lathe, it's probably not such a problem, but for a small lathe, you could well be doing it some mischief on all that sort of thing. One of the important things here with these is before you start knurling is you want to check what the pins are doing. As you can see there's a few scratches and gouges there. That needs to be greased with preferably with an EP type grease, and that's because when this thing is running, that's what that knurl is turning on. If you try to do it dry, you may find that you have everything seize up. I've had that happen to me once, and suddenly it comes to a grinding halt. And that's one thing you need to think about too, is when you're knurling, whether it's with a straight knurl or with a cross knurl, that's greased in there. That's all good. But if you're flooding that with lubricant, you may wash the grease out. So you need to check that every so often, and just take a little bit of care with that. When knurling, I usually put a lick of oil on the knurl and on the work. And that's simply because when you're knurling, bits of material will flake off. The knurl wheels themselves going over the material, there'll be a little bit of friction. That just seems to help a little bit for me. But having said that, I do knurling dry. It doesn't seem to make a great deal of difference. Certainly for something like that, which is aluminium, I was using WD-40 for that, because the knurling pattern will break up the oxide skin, and so the stuff may want to stick and weld onto the rollers. When I'm about to knurl something, a couple of things I'll do. One of them is, if the surface of the material isn't reasonably smooth and tidy, I'll be cleaning that up so I've got nice clean metal. The other one is that if I've got a knurl. Now, when you knurl something, it's going to actually raise the diameter, or make the diameter a little bit larger. And in fact, that's a bodge that's been used. If a shaft is slightly undersized, you can put a knurl on it, and it'll fit into a pulley or a bush or something a little bit better. Not the best of things to do, but sometimes needs must. But what I'll do is, because of the way the knurling tool, the geometry works, right, is that I'll actually put a slight step next to something so that I've got a nice precise spot where that knurl ends. It doesn't matter if you don't mind your knurl just sort of fading out, then that's okay. But that's one of those things that I do. It doesn't have to be deep, because all that's going to be happening is that's going to be displacing the material. What do we say? Half a pitch. So it's not going to be much. But that's something you can do. If you've got any holes, particularly holes with threads in them that go through the middle of the part, leave those till afterwards. And the reason for that is that the pressure you're putting on here with the knurl is significant, and what you might find is you actually shrink that hole. So what was a nice threaded hole that fitted, the bolt or whatever that had to go through there well, suddenly becomes a little bit tight, and you've got to recut it. So you might as well just leave it there. As you saw with the video where I bored out a very thin wall tube in a 3-jaw chuck, the action, the clamping action will tend to push that in. So what you might also find is that if the hollow in there is too great, the knurling, instead of doing a nice sharp knurl for you, will sort of push this stuff in, swage it in, and you'll get sort of a half knurl plus an undersized hole. So yeah, one of those things that leave the internal operations till you've done the knurl, and that way you'll get a little bit better. However, for setting up, I put the knurl tool in the tool holder. Then I'll adjust it out so that the axes of the knurl wheels and the part are vertical. Okay, you could be a little bit this way, you could be a little bit that way, but you really want to try and get that vertical, just so that it'll behave nicely. I'll then lock the carriage. The forces involved are such that if there's a bit of wear in your lead screws or something like that, it might try and push it back and forth. So I just lock the carriage, and that I find helps to get a more, shall we say, repeatable knurl. There are some people who say, oh well, you need to calculate your diameter and work out your pitch. I've never done that, and I've never had a problem. Okay, it seems to find its own way and work out what it's doing. So don't get hung up that, you know, if you've got a 12 TPI wheel, you know, that diameter has to be precisely whatever that is. Try it and see. You know, you might find that it's all right. You might find it's not. That knurl was pretty straightforward. It's aluminium, it's a soft piece of material. As you can see, there's lots of crud in that, so I'll take that across the wire wheel on the bench grinder in a moment and just clean that up a little bit. The other thing I'll do, if this was stainless, for example, those tips would be work hardened and they'd be quite sharp. So I'll get a file and I'll just run the file across just to take the very sharpness out of the tip. The other thing I'll do is get a chamfer tool and just come along and knock the corner of that off. You can see it's got a little bit of a spot where the stuff is squished out, and so if I then take that off, it just gives me a nicer knurl for finishing off. The last knurl I did was in aluminium, and that was relatively easy. The stuff's soft. I was only doing a small length, and I'd put a run-off groove there, so everything was fine. But if this was something that was work hardened, bit of monoll, bit of stainless steel, something like that, or I wanted a longer knurl, it's a question, okay, how do I get that? Well, what I've discovered is that if you try putting that on like that and then tighten that down, because of the work hardening nature of the material, you're probably not going to get a very good result out of it. So what I've found I do is if I start off with a half or even a third of a roller on, I get that down and then I get that to full depth. You can actually feed up on the stock and get a longer knurl out of it. And so that's a very handy technique if you've got some stainless and you want, say, well, even just a short knurl, is to start with just a little bit and then move along when you're at full depth. Now, I've also discovered that if you're not quite sure about your depth, you can stop, right? As long as you don't disengage the knurls, you stop, have a look at it, see what it's like, and then restart, apply a bit more pressure or move along or whatever you want to do. But I'll just show you how this all works. But in the meantime, thanks for watching. See you for the next one.